Howdy, welcome back to Space Teams. This video is also pretty short. This is lesson 9 on mission management, and I'm going to hand it over to Alexander here to explain it to y'all. So yeah, that's it from me.
Hello and welcome to another Space Teams Pro tutorial. This time we'll be talking about mission management in Space Teams Pro, as well as the extensions to event management and entity behaviors and what all of that means in the context of the program. So to get started, we'll take a look at this big diagram that shows kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. On the left side, we have kind of the most general level here, where you have events that are just actions that happen within Space Teams Pro, driven by conditions. And one of those at the end is an end condition that drives the end of the simulation, right? Moving to the right, we have the mission manager, which in a more specialized sense takes tasks that might be part of an individual mission. And there might be multiple missions within the same simulation, but this takes one of those missions and breaks it up into a sequence of tasks that might be actually sequential. They might not be, they might be concurrent. And it passes that to some sort of task manager. You don't have to have this step, but it helps to kind of organize this mission plan. And then moving even further right is how those tasks get converted to actual things that happen inside the simulation, right? That's what we call entity behaviors. It means how an entity implements what the mission manager is telling it to do. So let's take a closer look at each one of these and break up this big, scary diagram. So first up is the event manager, right? And it's basically just something that handles certain conditions driving events. So it's a piece of code or many pieces of code that basically control how events get triggered, essentially. And that might feed into the mission manager later on. It might drive certain tasks to get triggered inside the mission manager. But overall, it's just some way of controlling in a global sense what is going on inside the sim. Up next is the mission manager, which takes that as inputs, right? But in a more broad sense, it's just a sequence of tasks that depend on each other or on the time in the simulation or on certain things being in the right place, which is driven by the event manager. But the mission manager basically describes, okay, if some sequence of tasks gets completed, but then maybe one of them fails, what do we do? How do we modify the rest of the sim and the rest of the actions that are going to take place to account for this failure that arose in the sim? So it's basically handling the responses to things that happen in the simulation, right? For the task management, this is, again, an optional step, but it really helps to break it up into this kind of framework where you have an intermediate step between this high level action and then response to the action that the mission manager is doing and the entity behaviors, which are doing very low level implementation. It really helps to have what's called a task manager or a task graph, which handles where all the dependencies are going and basically what actually gets called, when a command is completed or if it's returned as incomplete. It also helps to dispatch the commands this way because you can contain information about what the command's dependencies were, and that can be used for things like tracking communications loss, that kind of stuff. But basically, inside here, the most simple way to do it would be to have task 2 depend on task 1, or maybe task 4 depends on the 3 before it, that kind of thing, right? And that would just allow you to more easily handle conditions and the list of tasks that are in your mission plan, right? So the last step here on the rightmost side is entity behaviors, which involves a lot of stuff, right? This is the most low-level implementation. And we're not going to go too deep into it, but essentially, once you get a command on a certain entity, for example, say a rover on the surface of the moon, the command might be something like drive to this coordinate, which is a great command at the mission manager level, just saying drive here. But on the entity level, there's nothing yet that tells it how to actually do that. To drive, it needs to power up, the motor, make the wheels spin so that it actually drives along the surface of the moon. And to do that, you need an entity behavior. Now, what happens inside here is once you identify that it's a movement command, in this example, right, you can pass that information to either a state machine or a behavior tree, where certain decisions can be made by the entity itself on how to respond to that command. So for example, if it's going up a hill, there might be a certain torque that you don't want to exceed on your wheels, or maybe your rover just can't handle it. So it moves at a slower speed. And that's part of the state machine, right? Another very important thing about an implementation like this is the ability to check whether or not the command is actually done. And that's usually done inside the state machine or behavior tree, which basically tracks the overall system state for this entity, whether it's currently driving or in a loiter or something like that, just a bunch of states, and it handles how those states transfer between each other. So say when you arrive within 5 meters of the target location, it might switch from driving to loiter, saying, okay, I got here, I arrived, we're done with this command. And then it'll check that condition, switch it to loiter, right? And that'll feed back into this level where it'll say, okay, command complete. And if it fails, for example, if it loses communications in the middle of that trip, it might return an early command incomplete and say, okay, now it's up to the mission plan to figure out what to do if the rover stopped in the middle of its journey. It failed to complete that movement command, right? So again, to go over this again, right, you start at the highest level with event management that controls global variables, global sim events, including the end condition. If it's not the end condition, it might dispatch events and basically send that over to the mission manager to say, hey, this key event happened. Maybe it's time to do a certain task that depends on it. And that's controlled by a task manager, which in here basically partitions it, sends the tasks at the appropriate times as commands, and the commands make their way to the entity level, which then goes into the state machine. The commands might take some time, like a driving command, or it might be take a picture with the camera that's on the rover, and that will be almost instant feedback that will then get passed back through here as either a success or a failure, right? So that right there is the basic gist of event, mission, and entity management within Space Teams Pro. And stay tuned for a more in-depth look at how to implement this in actual code. Thank you for watching.
That's it for this video. Make sure to check the description to get the link to the wiki so you can see anything from this video that you might need, and just an overall description of the video and anything else like that. So if you have any questions or anything like that, click that link. Thank you.